2 West Point appointments, and I went for the physical for my first West Point appointment, and discovered I was colorblind. And my uncle had some friends that got a second West Point appointment for me, and I got caught cheating on that round color dot share test, and I didn't relate the numbers, and the guy caught me on that. So I graduated from engineering school in 1943, May of 43. Got a commission as an infantry officer because I'd had 4 years of ROTC, and spent the summer playing around because they didn't want me then. In September, went to Benning and went through the OCS school.
Now you said both your father and your
my
uncle also were West Pointers.
His brother was younger, and he was a class of 17. My father was a class of 14.
Okay. All right, I'm going to go back and stop you and do an introduction to this. This is an interview at the New York State Military Museum, Saratoga Springs, New York. It is the 27th of December, 2004, approximately 3:30 p.m. Interviewers are Wayne Clark and Mike Russert. Could you give me your full name, date of birth, and place of birth, please?
William P. Cowgill, Cowgill. My age is 83. My place of birth was Letterman General Hospital, to Presidio, in San Francisco. I was conceived in the Philippines, where my father, as an engineer, was building the fortifications of Corregidor and Baguio and Fort McKinley. That he got sick and was shipped to San Francisco, and I was born at the Presidio.
Okay.
And
what was your educational background prior to entering service?
Well, I went through public schools in Lincoln, Nebraska, where my family had gone back, and I graduated from college at Syracuse University in a course in mechanical engineering in 1943.
Now, were you did you enlist, or were you drafted?
Well, I guess I enlisted. I went through, I signed up for ROTC as a freshman, and went right on through 4 years of ROTC and got my commission at graduation time.
All right. After you left Syracuse, where did you go from there?
Well, from Syracuse, I did nothing. I worked, as a matter of fact, I worked for a construction company to keep busy and to keep going. Then I went to Fort Benning in September. It was a class of, I think, of 298 in the OCS class, graduating in September. No, I went in September and graduated a little bit longer, or 3 months later. And I was assigned to a training company at Fort Benning, training ASTP students that were called in out of college. And I was there for about 6 months, and then was given orders to Joseph T. Robinson in Little Rock, Arkansas, and I was there for probably a month or so, and then was ordered to Kilmer, where they prepped us for going overseas, and I went over on one of the Queens. I can't remember which one of the Queens I went over on, big boat, and the ship landed in Gurik.
So if that was a liner, you probably didn't go in convoy then?
No, we were, it was zigzagged back and forth across the ocean.
Can I go backward a second? I forgot a question I wanted to ask you. Do you remember where you were and your reaction when you heard about Pearl Harbor?
Yeah, I was in college in the fraternity house, and it came over the radio. We were all talking about it because we were all that prime age for that. Yeah, it was a Sunday afternoon.
You must have been one of the few that knew where Pearl Harbor was then.
Well,
Did you?
I did know where Pearl Harbor was. I thought everybody knew where.
Well, there are a lot of
Harbor.
veterans we've interviewed that had no idea
Is that
where
right?
it was. So,
Yeah, but
what was your reaction? What was the reaction within the fraternity?
well, it was one of shock.
Mhm.
As a result, I have an affinity for the Japanese, for not liking the Japanese.
Okay, so where did you land I imagine you went right to England?
I landed in Gurrick, I think it was up in Scotland,
Scotland.
and then they took us by train down to the Salisbury Plains. And during this period of going overseas and get down to Gurrick, I was with a casual company of 200 second lieutenants. And they kept hooking us up with GIs to exercise. There was very little training, but a lot of 20-mile hikes with backpacks and so forth, just to keep us active and keep us out of trouble and keep us busy. And then sometime later, after going through quite a bit of that, we were shipped down to the Channel and got on a small Navy ship that took us across the Channel to Omaha Beach. But I got to Omaha Beach sometime in September, long after the shooting had stopped.
Was there any evidence of a battle that had taken place?
Well, we could
there?
we could see the debris, and the boat pulled up to a series of structures that they had apparently built over in England and shipped across, pulled across for landing. We walked off the boat. We didn't have to get down in the water and get out. And but we could see the debris, and there was it looked like it had been a pretty busy beach. And then we hiked up the hill to the top of the hill and went into a huge tent area.
Now, did you go in as a replacement at this time?
Well, at that time I was still with a company of 200 second lieutenants, replacement officers. And as I recall, you know, you're asking an 83-year-old guy to remember back 60 years. And but as I recall, we were there about 5 or 6 days, something like that. And then they took us to a group of us to the railroad terminal, where they signed us one of the 48 cars and 39 soldiers and the paperwork for the soldiers, and that was our car that was going up towards the front to take us up to eventually the outfit that we were going to be assigned to. And I was telling him about an incident that happened while we were on the train. We were running at night. The train kept stopping. I got off the train, you know, to exercise and walk around a little bit. And I ran into this guy who had gone to high school with my first wife, who's since deceased. And we got talking and so forth, and we went in the little station there to talk, and all of a sudden the train started up, and I got flash and left us, and we ran to catch the train, but we never made it. And there were two of us standing alongside that railroad track watching the train disappear in the distance. And we figured out that the only way to catch it, if we were going to catch it at all, would be to catch the next train and try and, and ride up with it. And we went through the night. Another train came along after a period, and I don't know where we were on that train, but we got on it, and and kept stopping, and we'd come into yards and we'd go around and look, see if we could find the train, and we eventually, before the night was over, found the train that we had gotten off of and left behind, which took us up to the up towards the front, and these are kind of foggy memories. Some mode of transportation we got into picked us up, a small group of us, and I was taken up to somebody who apparently represented the 4th Armored Division, Patton's 4th Armored Division, the 3rd Army, and they took us up to the outfit that we were going to be joining, but they did that at night. And I can remember wandering around up there at night looking for the guys that I was going to be with, for the troops and so forth. And I just know that it was a very mixed up situation, and it wasn't until the next morning when there was daylight and I could see the people and see what was going on that I got attached to B Company of the 51st Armored Infantry Battalion and the 4th Armored Division. Then we went into battle. Where I joined them, they were in battle, and my memory is just not very good about just exactly where that part was. I think it was somewhere around Metz, and but I remember that when you're new and everybody's strange and so forth, I became better acquainted with the other officers in the company. The captain that I worked with was a gentleman by the name of Belden from Canton, Ohio, who I saw later after the war. One of the officers was a Paget. Those are all fuzzy memories.
What position did they assign you?
Well, I was a second lieutenant platoon leader.
Okay.
And as I recall, the platoons were pretty well depleted. There was something like 12 or so in a squad, 4 squads in a platoon, which would have put somewhere around 50 people in the platoon. And as I recall, we never had more than 15 or 20 at the most, and sometimes less.
Were most of them veterans or most of them replacements?
Most of them are replacements, as I recall. I don't know whether my captain had come over with the 4th Armored. I don't know. I really don't recall.
Mm-hmm.
But as we got into it, and I became more acquainted with the people and the things, we of course used to ride the tanks. I had, as a platoon leader, I had 5 half-tracks, but we never used the half-tracks. I don't think I ever saw the half-tracks until later in the campaign when we were called up to Bastogne.
Was there a reason for that?
Well, yeah, I think that the half-tracks were pretty vulnerable. They were very lightly armored, and the way Patton used the 4th Armored Division was to keep bursting through these towns, and we'd go blazing through these towns riding the tanks, and if we got shot at and so forth, the tanks would drop us, and we would protect the tanks, and generally we always went into the town before the tanks to make sure there weren't German tanks in there lined up ready to knock out our tanks. So we'd go in and clear the front of the thing, and then the tanks would come up and we'd work our way through the towns. And But there was a lot of street fighting and house clearing at times, and other times I think the Germans, because the 4th Armored Division had a reputation of being, with Patton's method of attack of just blazing in and going through, I think that when the 4th Armored Division hove into sight, I think the Germans would take off out the other end of the town, because some of the towns we had some pretty heavy fighting in, and other towns we couldn't find the Germans. They were gone, disappeared.
Did you suffer a lot of casualties?
We used to have casualties, yeah. We had a few guys knocked off the tanks with rifle fire. We had a number of casualties from artillery fire. Because we get out there, the Germans start to shell the area, and we were pretty vulnerable to the shrapnel from the artillery. I can't remember all the towns we went through, but there were quite a few of them.
Signaling.
Well, the one battle that I remember, because they wrote it up and I've read it a couple of times, was the Battle of Singling in the Saar Basin, where
Now, was that before or after the Bulge? That was
before the Bulge.
before, okay.
We were.
Now that you referred, the book was the small unit actions that you talked about earlier.
It's a paper
Mhm.
paper bound
Right.
book put out by the War Department, printed by the War Department, and I remember riding into the town of Singling, and as usual they dropped us off and went in and cleared the front end of the town, and then the tanks came into the town behind us. But as we wandered into town and wandered up to the front corner, I was looking over a stone wall that was probably 4 or 5 feet tall. And I could look out, and probably not 30 feet away was a German tank, but he was pointing. As we came into the town, the German tanks were over on the sides, and I was looking at the side of the German tank, and there were, I think, 3 of them, as I recall, out there. They weren't moving, and our tanks couldn't get at them because of the stone walls and other things, and they couldn't go around and get at them because we were going up a hill. They were on the crest of the hill where this town was, and they would have our tanks would have been very vulnerable to the 88s. And we cleared the town and stayed in the town, and it was a fortified town. It must have been in the Siegfried line or the Maginot line. It would have been in the Siegfried line, I think, because that's in the German area. And but the houses were massive, and they were concrete, and some of them, and this particular spot was. And we couldn't get past the tanks that they had sitting around the town on the outside, although the Germans were not in the town. And they elected to have our unit back out. They pulled us back out of it. And they collected us, and we got up on the tanks, and then we went chasing down this road back down into the valley to go up to exit the town. And when we started to do that, the German tanks moved up and started shooting at us, and it was getting dark. And the thing that I can remember is the 88s shooting at us, and we could see the shells coming. And they were straight as an arrow at us, and our tanks were firing back at them. And the guns that we had were much slower, and they were lobbing towards the German tanks when the 88 was coming right at us, straight. I don't recall that they hit any of our tanks or hit any of us. We managed to, because we were moving pretty fast. They were racing out, but it was a pretty complete session there in the town of Singling, clearing out the Germans, and the tanks and everything. Then we went,
What month was that? Do you recall?
must have been November. Must have been November, because shortly after the Singling battle and everything, we went into to a rest area down in the Sar Basin someplace. I don't have any idea where it was. And while we were in this rest area, the Bulge started, and they called us all together and told us that the 101st Airborne had been cut off in Bastogne, and that we were going to go relieve them. And that was, I don't know, you know better what those dates are. December,
Yeah.
probably December 16th or 14th or 15th, somewhere in there, or maybe a few days later. But anyway, the 4th Armored Division, and it seemed like I was in the lead half-track. This is the only time I ever saw my half-tracks. They moved the whole division 150 miles in 36 hours, which was quite a feat to move all that material and tanks and so forth. And
Now, how did half-tracks handle on those roads?
they handled very well on the roads. The roads were pretty good roads, running up to Bastogne. There was a huge road going into Bastogne that we were on coming up from the south, and in the order of battle, I think in the lead half track with somebody, and I can't remember who it was and so forth. But we came up to this road, and we came up the road to this point where they had us dismount from the half tracks and so forth, and told us to go into this town, which was the town of Martelange. And they said, follow the road in and clear the town. So I took my platoon, and I guess there were others behind us, into the town of Martelange, and it was fresh snow on the ground, probably 4 or 5 inches of fresh snow. And as I got down the road a little bit, the road split. And they hadn't told me about the split in the roads. So I had to decide whether I was going to take the left fork or the right fork. And I figured I'd take the right fork as the right road to take. And in the taking the right fork, we came into the town of Martelange. Both led into the town of Martelange, but one came in, there was a cliff down through the center of the town that we were coming in. And the left road came on the top of the town, and the other road came in underneath the town, underneath the cliff that was on the thing. And the Germans had set up and were waiting for us on the higher road because they figured that we'd be coming in on the commanding ground. And instead we came in underneath them. And I remember that very well because as we were coming in, moving in and out of the doorways and so forth, going into the town, because we didn't know what was in there. We couldn't see anything. As we got in a little bit closer, I saw this group of guys in their white helmets down in the center of town, and I thought, oh my God, the MPs are here before us. So I whistled everybody out, and we got out on the road and started to march hike down the road. We were all strung out into the center of town to greet the MPs and everything, and we suddenly discovered that there were the Germans with the white canvas on their helmets, and they weren't MPs at all. And about the time we recognized them, they recognized us. And I was carrying as a weapon a squirt gun, which was a stamped, I don't know if you know what the squirt gun is, with a 45 caliber.
We had 3.
Yeah.
Grease gun, they call
Yeah,
it.
grease gun, yeah. And we had 2 magazines strapped one to the other, so we'd take the empty one out and shift the empty one in. And I emptied the first load at the guys in the road, and then we ducked in and worked our way down into the center of town, and the Germans went off in another area. There was a river through the center of town, and the Germans had blown the bridge, and we moved in up to the edge of the river, and by this time it was starting to get dark, and we could hear the Germans in their hobnail boots running on the other side of the town square, but it was too dark to see them, but we could hear them, and we settled in for the night and put out our outposts to protect us at the night, and settled in for the night, and we were called back to the CP, and they said, you know, the 101st has been cut off now, and they need us, and we're going to move out. And so we moved out in the middle of the night, trying to get all the guys who were grumbling about moving in the night. And we had to ford our way across the river and up this big hill on the way to Bastogne. And but the Germans had moved into that area, and we went through a number of towns, little towns. Warnack, the town that we were in at the time was Martelange, and Warnack was one of the specific towns I remember because we had a pretty heavy firefight in the town, and I lost some people there, and I can remember having to shoot the Germans and shoot and fight them, actually drive them out of the town. The ones that we didn't kill, but we lost a few people too. But my memory is not very good about whether there were other platoons with us. I remember this as being pretty much our platoon and our company doing this, and we had some tanks, but the tanks were back further because the Germans were on the northeast end of the town, and we were heading north, and the tanks didn't just drive out into drive up the roads because the Germans would have knocked them out, and so we had to clear ahead for them. And I remember that I got a bazooka that I used to hit one of the German self-propelled guns that from the roof of the upper story of a house that we were in. We could see the guy parked in the street down there, pointed in another direction, and I asked if we could get a bazooka, and they said we could, and I fired a bazooka at it and hit the back end of the self-propelled, and the guys all popped out of it. I didn't hurt anybody, I don't think, but they all popped out of it, and that thing sat there for the duration of that fight. But we kept moving. We slept on the ground, and
what kind of equipment did you have? Did you have winter gear at all?
most of us had the armored equipment. I had on overalls with the armor jacket on top, and
how about boots? Did you have winter boots?
we had those miserable laced boots that didn't help our feet at all. They used to get terribly cold. The only reason we were moving so much that we kept the circulation in our feet. The poor guys that had to sit in one spot for a long time got frozen feet as a result. But we kept moving up the road, and we were on the east side of the main road coming up into Bastogne, and that big road into Bastogne had huge trees on either side, and the Germans said at the times when we get close enough to see, the Germans every so often had blown down trees across the road to block the road, and so we were going to go across fields and so forth, and those were some of the times when we lost a lot of guys to the artillery fire, to the shelling, the shrapnel wounds. And I'm trying to remember the name of one of my fellow lieutenants that I was fairly near in the time, at the time, was bullet hit his helmet and put a big dent in his helmet and put a dent in his skull and knocked him down, and he was picked up later by the medics. Price was his name. But he later, after the war, survived the war, but was crippled as a result of the head wound, and went to law school and wound up as a judge in Ohio someplace. I never was able to contact him, never to find him, but I heard from one of the others that he wound up being a judge in Ohio. But we kept plowing up the roads, and they kept sending us off to different areas to clear the roads because the Germans were in the area. And boy, we're going back so far. But I remember my last day because they we were almost to Bastogne. We were near the outskirts of Bastogne on the 28th of December, and I think that was the day that they relieved Bastogne, or maybe on the 27th the tank had sneaked in. But they sent us out at first light in the morning, and the area that we were maneuvering in was pine trees. A pine was a crop, and they used to plant them in rows, so that if you were in an old crop of pine, you could look at 90-degree angles and see great distances. But if it was a newer crop and the branches were growing down around the ground, you couldn't see what was 15 or 20 feet to your right, because it was so thick and there was snow on them. And on the morning of the 28th, they sent us out early, as I say, at first light, and we were walking along this probing for the outskirts of Bastogne, because we had terrible maps. They didn't anticipate this, of course, and we had awful maps. So we didn't have a map that we could read to see, exactly where we were, or where the forest areas were, and where the other things were. And we were walking along, hiking along the edge of this heavily wooded area, when we were fired on suddenly, and I was leading the platoon, and one of the things that you have to understand, that a lot of these guys were replacements. They'd never seen it, and when the people start shooting at them and everything, in this case, a lot of them took off, turned around and took off in the other direction. And I had a sergeant who was an Indian, American Indian, and I tried to set up a machine gun to shoot back at him, because the guy had dropped the gun, and we had a machine gun and a bipod and a box of ammunition that we'd spray the area where they were firing at us from. And we got the gun mounted, and I don't think we got the box of ammunition on it when we were hit by probably one of their grease guns.
Schmeiser?
So yeah, the high-speed thing. But anyway, I don't know whether I was hit first or my sergeant was hit first, but I remember being being hit in the right leg, in my right leg, and feeling like it's somebody, big rubber band that twanged a big rubber band, and I got knocked over on my back. And my sergeant apparently was knocked down also, and he was shot through the elbows and the stomach. And I was down over trying to get the gun going, and it hit hit me, but I got shot through the hand. The bullet went in the thumb and came out here and broke the thumb. And I had another bullet across my belly. And but my major wound was must have had 6 or 8 rounds through my right femur, which practically chopped my leg off. And this happened, as far as best I could figure out, about 6:30 in the morning. And the Germans came out after they knocked us down and picked us over. They took my guns. I had my father's .45 caliber pistol that he'd given me to take to the war in the holster that he'd given me. And they took our weapons and went through our pockets to see what we had. And I had a wonderful long parachutist knife that I'd taken off a parachuter that I'd killed further back down the road, where you push the button and the knife popped out. And I thought it was the greatest thing I ever had, but they took it back. But being shot about 6:30 in the morning, and I was laying at the time in 6 to 8 inches of snow. It was pretty cold, but we'd gotten used to the cold because we'd been living in the cold for so long. And the Germans wandered around us for a while, and then they disappeared back into the trees. And
Did they try to help you at all?
no, they didn't do any first aid or anything, no. And I lay in that snow with my sergeant from 6:30 in the morning till 9:30 that night, when the group of the Germans came out. 8 of them I seem to remember, and 4 of them picked me up. I couldn't speak German, and they didn't speak any English. And 4 of them picked me up, and 4 of them picked up my sergeant, and they started to carry us across an open area, a little saddle in the area. And we hadn't gone more than 5 minutes or so, as I recall. We were challenged by an American outpost. So I started yelling, "Don't shoot, don't shoot," because I was conscious. And the Germans turned and walked us into the outpost. And at that point, they took the Germans prisoner. And I'd never know whether the Germans were going to take us across the clearing into the next set of woods and drop us, or whether they knew it was there and they were trying to surrender. Because by the 28th, this is the night of the 28th, the Americans the skies had opened up, and the Americans had come back in and were beating off on them pretty severely. And anyway, they called up an aid jeep and put us on the aid jeep and drove us into an aid station. And my sergeant died in the aid station because when they started to move him, he started to bleed again. And he bled to death in the aid station and died in the aid station. And I can remember talking to the guy. He said, "You've got the $1 million wound." And I said, "What's the $1 million wound?" He said, "You're going to go home. They're going to have to ship you back to the States," which I thought was a great idea. And then they gave me a shot of morphine or something like that. And I don't really remember what happened after that. But I always regretted that I didn't get the names of some of those Germans that took us in, have them write down their name and their address, and the guys in the outpost and the guys in the aid station, because my circumstances were rather unusual. I think it would have been very interesting to go back and get what their version of it was. But anyway, that ended the war for me. I spent over 2 years in the hospital because I had.
Were you sent back to England?
I went, I think, to Luxembourg City for the initial surgery. Mm-hmm. And I know the doctor that did the job on my leg was from Hawaii. And I did know his name at one point, but it's gone. And then we got on the hospital train and went back to Cherbourg, where we went across the channel over to England and went into a Quonset hut evac hospital, where and I was there for a couple of months, I guess, and they put me in traction there. You know, they drill a hole through your leg and put cables and weights on it to stretch out the muscles and everything, so that when your leg repairs, it repairs as close to the right length as possible. And I was in the station hospital for a couple of months, and they put me back in a plaster cast from my armpits, the right leg completely, and the left leg down to the knee, what they call a hip spica. And I went back on the other queen. I don't know which queen that was either. I just know I came over on one queen and went back on the other. And was shipped back to Halloran General Hospital in Staten Island, which was a great spot. And was there for months, and because they had to do more surgery on my leg, and the sciatic nerve injury had to be fixed, like a telephone cable. They kept me for a while, but they send me home on 30-day leave, and then I'd get a 30-day extension. Then I'd go back to the hospital, and they'd do something to me, and then as soon as they could, they'd send me back home. So I was back and forth to the hospital. But my first wife had just delivered a baby, so I had a child back home that I hadn't seen, and she wasn't able to come because of taking care of the baby and so forth. So we corresponded by phone a little bit, and I had an uncle that I'd mentioned, who was the West Pointer, was spending some time in New York City at the time, and he'd come out to the hospital to see me. And I remember the first time he came out, he brought me a bottle of bourbon, but they took it away from him at the gate. He was very upset about that. But well, that was the experience. I had a great time in the hospital, though. We one of the guys in the hospital was a pilot by the name of oh boy, here we go again. Oh, I forgot. But his father, he grew up in New York City. His father was in the dry goods business in New York, and we used to hobble over to the officers' quarter at night to sit around and drink beer and converse and everything. And he came to us one day and he said, I can get an ambulance. You guys want to go into New York some night with me? He said, I've got a spot in New York that I can go to. We said, sure. So we got a nurse and an ambulance, and about a half a dozen of us piled in the back of the ambulance. And we drove into the Blue Angel, which was a nightclub in New York City. And we'd sit around this little table with these chairs and everything. And I remember one guy, a guy by the name of Boyle, had his shoulder shot up, and he was in a cast with his arm out, but we were all pretty well beaten up guys. And we'd get into the Blue Angel, and the people would kill us with free drinks. And we did that 4 or 5 times. Then on our way home, we'd stop and have breakfast at an all-night restaurant. And then I wound up retiring and going back to Rochester, where my first wife, was living with our child. Her family were there.
Now, when were you finally discharged?
Oh, gosh, I don't know. It was, I think in March I was retired, actually not discharged. I was retired for, would that be 45 or 46?
Probably 46 if you were 2 years.
46, yeah. it's interesting that when I was home on these leaves, Rochester's a big Kodak town, and and we were living with her family, who had this lovely place out in the country, but it had all sorts of yard work to be done out there, and I was sitting out in the yard one Sunday pulling weeds out around the bushes and digging up the thing so to spruce them up a little bit. And this big old guy came wandering out to see me, who said, I hear you've been shot up in the service. And I said, yes, I have. He said, what branch were you in? And I said, the infantry. He said, so was I in the first war. And he said, have you been to school? And I said, yes. And he said, what did you study? And I said, engineering. He said, did you graduate? And I said, yes. He said, where'd you go to school? And I said, Syracuse. He said, so did I. This guy happened to be Ralph Eckberg, who was the head of the engineering, construction, and maintenance at Kodak Park, which employed about 50,000 people. He had a big job. And he said, how come you're pulling weeds for Joe Brown, as a graduate engineer? And he sent one of our fellow Syracuse friends who was working for him out a couple of days later to pick me up and took me down to Kodak and took me through the whole engineering services business that he had, and back up to his office, and he said, what do you want to do? And I said, well, I can't do anything because I'm still in the Army. He said, well, we'll work on that. And but I said, no, I like the shop. I like working with the metal down in the shops and everything like that. I think maybe a couple of 3 weeks later, he called up and said they had permission from the somebody to put me to work at Kodak Park, because they were trying to get engineers and trying to get engineers lined up for the future. And I went to work in the machine shop at Kodak Park. They had me on a bench filing castings. And I was going in and out on crutches, but I could sit on a bench stool and so forth. And I went to work for Kodak and worked for them for 8.5 years in the shop areas. I discovered I could make more money selling to them than I could working for them, so I went out in my own business.
Okay. Did you ever meet Patton at all?
No, I kept thinking that I'd see him. Oh, one thing is that the combat commander of my combat command in the 4th Armored Division was Creighton Abrams, who eventually was Chief of Staff.
Right. What were your opinions of Patton?
I thought he was great. When I heard about the guys in the Hurricane Forest and the way they got shelled and shot up, moving the way they did, a little bit every day, I thought Patton, but I didn't find that out till later. But I had no problem with Patton. I know some of the guys had a problem with him, but I didn't.
What did you think of Abrams as a commander?
I didn't really know Abrams. I didn't. Okay. I know about him,
Right. Okay.
Patton had a history.
Yes,
Abrams didn't.
Yeah.
But no, we didn't see those guys very much. We were up there. The only guys that we did see on occasion were the forward observers for the artillery, but they weren't riding the tanks with us.
What rank did you retire?
I retired as a first lieutenant.
Okay. Did you ever make use of the GI Bill?
The GI Bill, no, because I was out of college by that time.
Did you use it to buy a home or anything?
No, I never did. No, I didn't. In fact, I didn't use it until in the last few years, as I started to have more problems with my legs. I have 2 hip replacements, a knee job, partial replacement of the knee, and a fused ankle. This
is all on the leg that we...
This is all the result of the leg injuries, yeah.
Okay.
And
did you ever use the 52-20 club?
no. I don't know what that is.
It was like an unemployment, 52 weeks, you
No,
got $20 a
I'm
week.
never out of work.
I figured it sounded like you never did. Did you join veterans organizations at all?
No, I didn't.
Any reunions or?
I used to go back to 4th Armored Division reunions.
Uh-oh.
Maybe I shouldn't say this in front of my daughter. I went back to 4th Armored Division reunion, and Creighton Abrams was running the division reunion, and I wrote him a check for something like $10 or something like that for a thing, and the check bounced.
So you never went back.
Did you ever stay in contact with anyone that was in service with you?
Yes, I did. We had one of the platoon leaders was a guy by the name of Melragon, who lived in Ohio, around Akron, Ohio. And Dad Melragon, because he was about 30 years old, we called him
He was an
Dad.
old-timer.
And I stayed in touch with him and got Christmas cards from him and so forth. And he died, I don't know how many years ago, Edie. Maybe 5 or 6 years ago. And he ran a farm. He was off a farm out in Ohio. He used to write me these notes on the Christmas things. He says, still taking care of the dung pile. But
How do you think your time in the service changed or had an effect on your life?
well, I think it was a great growing up experience for me. I didn't mind it at all. I thought it was great, but I wouldn't want my 2 sons to ever have to go through what I went through. Take the chances of being done in by the things like they're having over in Iraq or places like that.
I think
But-
it was interesting, one little point was the doctor said that if it had not been so cold, you would have bled
Oh,
to
when I was
death.
laying out on the ground, yeah, for 15 hours.
You know, that's one thing I wanted to ask you.
It
was about the bleeding.
obviously retarded the bleeding and the shock. Yeah, because I couldn't move.
But did you feel much pain from it at all, or
I don't recall feeling any
Uh-huh.
pain.
must have been just cold?
Yeah, I don't recall if I did. And I don't know how I passed 15 hours. I don't recall how I passed 15 hours. But I know I was shot in the dark and went through the day and picked up in the dark.
All right. Well,
Yes,
thank-
and I think I just wish I'd grabbed some names, followed up with some of these people. But no, I've survived since the war. As you get older, and you get to be 83, some of the little problems you have when you're younger get a little more difficult. But when I came back from the war, I ran. I used to get up in the morning, 6 mornings a week, and run. I did that for 23 years. But I got to the point now where I can't walk around the block, Time takes a lot of these things out of you. But I have no regrets. I had a good life. I survived, and I've got a wonderful family. And I'm glad to be alive.
Okay. Well, thank you very much for your interview.
Thank you.